I think we'll start. We've got a lot to talk about tonight. Welcome to a night in the John Oxley Library, the first for 2015. And of course, Anzac Day is almost upon us this coming Saturday, which will be the centenary commemoration, of course. So we really want to have a good look at how we got here 100 years after the landings at Gallipoli. How did it all start? I mean, is what we're commemorating this week the same thing that we commemorated in 1995, 1953 or 1916? I think some things have probably changed. It's a fascinating topic, not just the actual historical fact of the events, but why we're all so interested in understanding our own feelings, really, about it. What is it we're being asked to remember, and what is I suppose, the religious significance of what I imagine might be a large number of non-church-going Australians attending a dawn service, considering the big changes we've experienced in the last century as well in church. So I'm Ian Townsend, and I've been a John Oxley Library Fellow here, and I'm also a research student in history at the University of Queensland. I'm a journalist with ABC Radio National, and Fran Kelly, the presenter of RM Breakfast, I see, is over for the event this week in Turkey. And Radio National, along with just about every media outlet in the country, is going to be doing something about Anzac Day, as you'd expect. Our guests are from the History Department at the University of Queensland as well, Mark Cryle and Martin Crotty, both historians who've researched and written about Anzac Day. Martin Crotty is in fact the head of the School of Historical and Philosophical Inquiry at UQ, and Mark Cryle's a PhD candidate and is writing his thesis on the development of the Anzac legend. Mark's a well-regarded songwriter and performer, and we're hoping to get a song from multi-talented Mark a bit later. And in my family, Anzac Day has been a big topic of conversation because I've got 3 young girls and the eldest one's in high school, so they're starting to ask questions about what it's all about. And my eldest girl's in the Girl Guides, a good paramilitary outfit. Maybe not so much today as it was when I was a kid. I was in the Scouts and learnt to set rabbit traps, for which I'd be arrested today, which sort of indicates how much attitudes have changed, really, in this generation. So Charlotte's, my eldest daughter's been asked to do something for Guides Night this week, make a wreath of poppies, bake some Anzac biscuits, and in fact, I recalled and I managed to find my grandmother's Anzac biscuit recipe from, I think it's the 1920s or 30s. I only say that because all the other recipes are very much of that era, so I'm assuming this is an early recipe she wrote out, probably copied it from a local newspaper. But it's pretty much the same as what we're baking today, so some things don't change. So we're really instilling a strong memory of Anzacs and diggers and mateship and this tradition into our kids, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, I guess, in many ways. And as a parent, I suppose I'm encouraging it. and we might even go to the dawn service this year, but it's not necessarily history. It's something else, I think, that we're thinking about. So Martin, I'm assuming that our collective memory of Gallipoli has departed somewhat from the historical facts. Is that true?
Yeah, very much. Any act of commemoration is a good way to forget history, as it was put in a film called The History Boys. I think the actual line is the quickest way to forget something is to commemorate it, something along those lines. Yeah. So there's a lot of touchstones about the legend, about mateship, about egalitarianism, about the courage and the sacrifice, and they died for our freedom and all the rest of it. But I think that a lot of that has masked the history of it, and that is what concerns me most as an historian, the way that people engage very deeply, very emotionally, very enthusiastically with the legend, but a lot of the history is completely overlooked. And I think if you look at the past and you just pick up these touchstones, you can get the wrong messages, you can learn the wrong things, you can miss a lot of opportunities for actually learning from the experience. So that's my great gripe with the Anzac legend. I don't have any problem with the way that we actually commemorate the dead. After all, we sent 60,000 people off to their deaths, and I think that needs to be remembered. Those people did often enlist from high motives. They died horrible deaths. They often did perform pretty amazing feats on the battlefield. I think the moral causes that they fought for in World War I are a little obscure, but in World War II, I think they're much clearer. And I think that, you know, I'm very glad I didn't have to fight the Nazis, or I didn't have to fight invading Japanese armies. But if we take it back to World War I think that the history is often very poorly understood, and that is because we smother it a lot with the Anzac legend. I could be rather provocative and say that the Anzac legend is designed to do that, and has always had the purpose of doing that, but perhaps Mark might want to...
Well, yeah, Mark, I guess, can we have both? I mean, is there room for a myth and the facts? Can we have two threads here?
Well, I think the answer to that is that we do have a myth, and we also have some very interesting facts. And just taking up on the point that Martin said about smothering some facts, you know, that what was actually happening was there was a war going on. People weren't about to be told the truth of that experience. And they needed, you know, the idea was that we somehow remember those men who died, and we memorialize that. At the same time, what we're trying to do is get more men to go and die. So there's that inherent paradox in the commemoration from the very start. It starts as a way to mobilize the nation around the war, and the message that the war is horrific and traumatic is one that seems to be washed away in that process. And taking on from where Martin was, maybe it's a message that still gets washed away about war being ugly, horrific and traumatic.
So has it? So are we? Has it evolved in some ways to tell a different myth? Have the myths changed depending on what I suppose the authorities want as a sort of a national narrative?
Well, I can take up one example of a very significant way in which it has changed, but lots of ways in which it hasn't too. I can give you one, I'm sure Martin could give you others, but if you look at the Anzac shrine in Anzac Square and look up at the inscription on it, it doesn't say lest we forget. It actually says for God, King and Empire. So one of the things that's often forgotten in this celebration of Australian nationalism is that these men were fighting for the British Empire. This was a British Empire military strategy to help the Russians and also to, you know, expand the British Empire and its influence, you know. We tend not to think of Anzac Day as something which is in any way British, but there are significant rhetorical artifacts that still exist. For example, Lest We Forget, which is Rudyard Kipling, comes from a poem which is written in 1897 and predates that. And what Kipling is on about is we need to remember that the British Empire could be at risk, so we need to protect it. That's what he's saying. We must not forget that great empires might fall. And the other is the words from the Anzac Ode, which come from a poem by Lawrence Binyon, which was published in September 1914, well before the Australians are fighting. So the key bits of the high rhetoric of Anzac still acknowledges its kind of sense of Britishness around that. So that's one of the significant ways in which it has changed.
Martin?
Yeah, I think the way that these things are commemorated and memorialised and the way that these myths develop tells us more, not about what actually happened, because that's the history of it. The mythology is often about what the mythologisers want. And I think it's pretty clear that in the wartime, mythologisers wanted to assuage that sort of grief, deal with that, reassert the nobility of the cause, and get more people to enlist. In the 1920s, it was very much about our imperial loyalty. Since the rise of Australian nationalism, it's become very much about Australian national identity and Australian qualities, mythological qualities such as egalitarianism, mateship, physical courage and all the rest of it. And it could even be argued that Anzac is something of a sanctuary, a nostalgic sort of escape, if you like, from modern, globalised, multicultural, gender-equal Australia. Here's back in a time where the white man is the centre of attention. And I think it has some sort of nostalgic appeal. I don't think it's entirely coincidental that the revival of Anzac took place at a time when Australia was turning more and more to Asia, when Australia was becoming more explicitly multicultural, when the last of those empire ties were being cut, and as the world was globalising. We didn't see a disappearance of national myth during the great sort of developments of globalisation in the 1990s and 2000s. We saw a revival of nationalism, and this is around the world. The Scots wanted their own parliament, the Welsh, there's the whole Balkan disaster. This is our sort of bit of it in Australia. The retreat to nationalism in a globalising environment.
So that's where we are at the moment, is it? Do you think this is what Anzac Day is being used for at the moment, to promote nationalism?
I think it is. It's used to promote national cohesiveness at a time when a whole lot of things could fracture. It pastes over, if you like, cultural or ethnic or class tensions in Australia. We're all together because of the Anzacs. It's a sort of unifying myth, which has its benefits. I'm not entirely dismissive of it, but I think it often serves the needs of the mythologisers as opposed to being about the people we actually commemorate.
Well, Mark, back in 1916, which I'm assuming was the first Anzac Day, how was that first Anzac Day formulated? What actually happened?
Well, it was obviously the first anniversary commemoration was on 25 April 1916. But the idea of commemorating that event, of doing something important about it, was a fact of life shortly after. I mean, there was actually a patriotic event commemorating the landing on Gallipoli before the news. They'd heard that they probably were doing that. So before the news was actually released in the Australian papers, there was a commemorative event. So Australians were fairly gung-ho about the idea of doing this. So there are a whole series of things called Anzac Day, Gallipoli Day, a variety of kind of patriotic performances that go on. In Queensland, in the early months of 1916, there's a meeting in what is now the old museum, the exhibition hall, where an organisation under Canon Garland, whose papers are here, they set up a committee which sets out a certain design for how they want Anzac Day to happen. And the legacy of their work is still there. In the Victorian Education Department, they were having meetings in December of 1915 about how they should commemorate Anzac Day in Victorian schools. It's a very bits and pieces kind of job. So if you go looking for some high moment of creation and origin, what you get is a fairly messy collection of bits and pieces sort of coming together and falling apart a bit for the rest of the war. And then it's really not until the 1920s that I think it, from stuff that Martin's written, you have a sense that you begin to get a cohesive commemoration happening, because at 1916 it starts with a bang, but 17 and 18 are looking pretty light on.
But you mentioned Canon Garland there. He had some specific ideas about what Anzac Day should be for and what should be done.
He clearly did. And he was a military chaplain. And he had dealt with the trauma of people who had to deal with the death of their loved ones. But he was also the secretary of the recruiting committee. So he was very conscious of the need to mobilize people around the war. So he had to balance those paradoxes. And what actually happened in the streets of Brisbane in 25th of April 1916 is basically it starts to look a hell of a lot like a kind of military triumph, a huge march of people down the street. But there are clear indications that when the men who were wounded actually started to appear, that there was a sense of shock in the crowd. You're actually dealing with traumatized people, and there was a sense of the collective grief. Insofar as Anzac Day was about controlling that grief, it failed. It sort of became an outlet for it in a sense.
And so there was a religious element to it as well from the start. Obviously, Canon Garland had that in mind.
Very much so. And there had been a number of commemorations in churches prior to this. But even then in Australia, there was a sense that while many people went to church, and a church service was a part of the original design, significant numbers of the population were not regular churchgoers, and their needs needed to be acknowledged publicly. So what actually happened is these kind of church commemorations started to become more apparent in kind of civic spaces. They were held in big public, civic spaces where a number of clergymen would stand up and deliver this kind of thing. So you have the sense that these ecclesiastical kinds of iterations are starting to come into the public forum more and more, and that's sort of what Garland... I mean, the church is good at liturgy, so it's hardly surprising that politicians look to churchmen to say, produce a liturgy around this, and that's what they did.
And so where did all the drinking and gambling come from?
It certainly wasn't apparent in 1916. And I think Martin would know a lot more about this stuff than I do, but you have a sense where the soldiers themselves come back and feel that Anzac Day belongs to them, that they're the rightful owners.
Yeah, it has a sort of high diction element of lest we forget and their name liveth forevermore and all that kind of thing. And it's quasi-religious language. It's, we have a dawn service. These are people who laid down their lives for us. It's replete with religious connotations. But for a lot of the soldiers, they wanted to catch up with their old friends. They wanted to get drunk. They wanted to tell stories that only former comrades would understand. This isn't so much the officers and all that kind of thing, but your average Joe Blow who'd been a private, who'd served for a couple of years, seen some pretty awful things, done some pretty horrific things himself, maybe still struggling with the legacy of it. They're not so interested in the high diction and the wreath laying and the high language. That's not their kind of war. They want to be with their mates, talk about what they went through, exchange some anecdotes, catch up with old friends. So it's always had that sort of dualistic element to it. And Anzac, I think, has always struggled with that sort of, struggled to reconcile those things. But I think that part of its strength and part of its, the reason that it survived for a century is it's so malleable and so multi-dimensional. If you are grieving for someone, you can talk about the grief. If you're an ultra-nationalist, you can find the Australian qualities in it. If you are an imperialist in the interwar period, you can find imperial loyalty in it. You can go to the church services or you can go to the pub. It caters for everyone, well, not for everyone, but it's open to so many readings and so many different emphases. Was then, is now, and I think that that's part of the reason why it's survived and adapted.
So it is a healthy thing though then, if it has all those parts and it has evolved to, people latch on to different things and they've managed to change it. You mentioned the soldiers added the drinking and the gambling obviously, and that and Canon Garland wouldn't have approved of that, but then the politicians, obviously then take all of that and try to conscript it as well, and then it heads off somewhere else perhaps. I'm sure after 1916 it changed pretty quickly. Did it, Mark, 1917, 1918 when the war started to go sour?
What actually happens during the war, as many will know, is that there are two major conscription plebiscites in late 1916, again in 1917. So what you have in Australia is a home front which is extremely socially divided. There's incredible bitterness. There's a lot of public violence around these issues. And what actually happens in Anzac Day is it sort of presents the mythology of being cohesive nationally. But the fact is that it's run by those people who are trying to win the war. It's sometimes forgotten that that 60% of Australia's eligible men did not volunteer. You know, so you've got a very significant portion of the Australian population who are either deeply pissed off about the whole thing, or traumatised by it, or at best indifferent, and certainly sick of hearing about it. So what actually happens in 1917 and 1918 a bit is that these major sort of capital city kinds of huge commemorative events start to break down, and you actually see them splitting into different parts. You also see individuals sort of noting the date on the diary and running their own small commemorative events in gardens. And of course, this is a major political thing. So by 1917 and 1918, some unions are running their own individual kind of Anzac Day thing, which doesn't have all the loyalist conservative palaver that's getting dished out. But what's actually happening at the formal Anzac Days is that the issue of recruiting becomes a major one. So increasingly they're used as opportunities to just impugn anyone who isn't a volunteer. So, you know, it's a way of, the shirkers are, you know, clearly not welcome. And what's actually happening at some point is men who are rejected volunteers are asking if they can wear their badges and march on Anzac Day. Because if you're a young man and you're not in uniform, then you're not welcome at Anzac Day in 1917, 19. It's not a place for you.
That exclusion, does it still exist to some extent? I do notice that, you know, historians that try to point out where the myths exist are often attacked quite viciously. Is it exclusive? You mentioned also a symbol of patriotism that Anzac Day has become. Has it become something that people are almost frightened to speak out about with a contrary point of view?
Yeah, very much. And I was discussing this with a couple of friends who have been on the receiving end of this in last couple of days. Someone, Joan Beaumont, who wrote a beautiful book called Broken Nation, Australia during World War One. I think it's the best book about Australia's experience of World War One. She's a lovely woman, military historian, social and cultural historian. It's just a brilliant piece of work. She was viciously abused by someone the other day in language that I wouldn't dare to repeat. I've been viciously abused. I've had a death threat from someone who objected to something that I wrote, which I thought was actually pretty mild. The death threat certainly wasn't. So, you know, Anzac has expanded in some ways and become more inclusive, but if you don't adhere to the mythology, you can very easily be regarded as un-Australian. And there's any number of touchstones for this. There's Tony Abbott the other day saying that we should all go, or all Australians should go to dawn services. There was Brendan Nelson when he was Education Minister and had the bit about Simpson and his donkey put up in every state school classroom in Australia, even though John Simpson Kirkpatrick had only been in Australia for 4 years. Was in fact a POM. So it's a sort of gathering of the faithful, if you like. That's how I see it. And everyone, if you wanted to be cynical about it, you could say that everyone strokes each other's egos and congratulates each other and says how wonderful they are. And look at those nasty people over there who didn't volunteer or didn't believe in the war or couldn't handle their grief in an appropriate way, or who think that there's other things that we should be talking about in Australian history, or who suggest that the history is actually quite different from the mythology. So it does have that sort of, if you don't go along with this, then you are unpatriotic, un-Australian. And I think that that's particularly so in Australia. I've been wondering why this is so. I'm actually from New Zealand. I came across about 20 years ago. And I'll just sidetrack a little bit there and tell you a little anecdote about when I gave a lecture about Anzac when I was at the University of Newcastle, and I upset a couple of people by pointing out some of the gaps in the mythology. And a student in a tutorial afterwards sort of thumped the table and says, "What really gives me the shits is having a New Zealander come and tell us about Anzac." And, you know, I had to point out what the N and the Z stood for. So it's quite different in New Zealand, where it's a much more solemn commemoration, much more grieving about the dead. I think it's the things that are distinctive in Australia that make it such a touchstone of national identity and patriotism are firstly the fact that we didn't have conscription. If you have conscription, then there is no need to pressure people to enlist because they'll be enlisted by the state when they're told to. If you are not in the armed forces, then you must have a good reason to not be in the armed forces. You presumably are medically unfit, or you're not allowed to go because of a reserved occupation, or all your brothers have gone, or something like that. And the other thing which Mark has written about, and we've discussed extensively, is the fact that Australia doesn't really, before Anzac, have an appropriate national day. The French have got Bastille Day, the Americans have got July 4, Independence Day. Well, what do we have in Australia? Well, 26th of January didn't cut it. That really only applied to New South Wales, and it was about a bunch of convicts who were sent from England to New South Wales. It didn't mean a hell of a lot to Victorians, West Australians, Queenslanders, or whatever. So what are you going to celebrate? Well, 1st of January doesn't really work either. Federation was not a particularly exciting event, and everyone's hung over on the 1st of January anyway. You know, there's a space or a lacuna, as Mark calls it, in the national commemorative calendar. We don't have religious holidays in Australia. They don't really work either because this is a pretty secular society and we have a large Irish element. So just what are you going to gather around? Well, a story where Australians on an ancient battlefield, you know, it's sort of waiting to happen, I think.
So we were looking for a myth, were we, even before it happened?
I think we were looking for a myth, and I think in the early 20th century there's a very strong idea that it needed to be a national myth, a military or martial myth.
So Empire Day or Wattle Day, did they exist then? They didn't cut it either.
They did. Empire Day didn't cut it because there were a lot of nationalists, and it was a bit hard to get, who found it very hard to get excited about the empire. Wattle Day didn't really cut it because it didn't have a dramatic narrative about it. Mark's probably more qualified to speak on this than I am. I hope I haven't taken all your best material from your thesis, Mark. But I'll pass it over.
Yeah, well, just endorsing, you know, what Martin's saying, is there a sense that we'd had a kind of military moment prior to Gallipoli, of course, notably the Boer War. And before soldiers went away to fight in the Boer War, some people were saying, this will be the birth of our nation. Of course, it wasn't. There was no defining kind of military moment in the way there was with Gallipoli. Some of the Victorian rifles got a pretty dodgy performance at Wilmansrust. You know, a lot of Australians surrendered to a fairly small number of Boers. The British were quite scathing of that. Significant numbers of Australians were involved in the major military operation they were involved in was burning farmhouses and putting Boer women and children into concentration camps where they died of horrible diseases. 25% of them, yeah. And a very significant numbers of the Australians there died from disease too. So it was really hard to find some great uplifting sort of story about the Boer War. And they sort of came back in dribs and drabs and, you know, they were sort of, you know, there were a few monuments put up, it wasn't ignored. But it didn't fulfil the expectations about it being a moment of national birth in the way that Gallipoli did.
And I think the other thing about that is no one really noticed. But at Gallipoli you have poets like Masefield and war correspondents like Ellis Ashmead Bartlett. You know, if you're going to put on a performance about nationalism and your national identity and your national characteristics, someone's got to see it. And in the Boer War, there was nothing much to show them, but you have this dramatic landing at Gallipoli, which Ellis Ashmead Bartlett immediately writes up. He says there's been no finer feat in the war than this landing in the dark and the storming of the heights. You know, he wouldn't have known. He was on a yacht well offshore. But he wrote what people wanted to hear. And here was the martial myth that people had been looking for. The Germans had their wars of unification, the Americans had their revolution, the French had their revolution, and here was the Australian equivalent, and everyone could see it and notice it as well. And it was in the world's press. So it fitted the bill.
So how did it look in the 20s, 30s, and 40s? I mean, there must have been fluctuations in.
Yeah, I think immediately after the war it looks pretty stagnant, and it might even be that it's sort of going into a period of decline. I think one of the key figures for it taking off again is the RSL. the RSL was an extraordinarily powerful organisation in Australia, the RSSILA as it then was, the Returned Sailors and Soldiers Imperial League of Australia. Note the word imperial. But the Anzac legend really suited them. They had volunteered. They said, because we are the ones who volunteered, because we fought for the nation and the empire, we are the first citizens. Our citizenship comes with a premium. Now, one way that you can assert that is to have a major occasion in which everyone honours you. It was tied up too with their quest for pensions and for better benefits from the government, but they always had this rhetoric: we are the ones who have served the nation more so than anyone else. Thus, when a job comes up in the state or Commonwealth public service, we want first crack at it. And they got first crack at it. We want better pensions for our war service than what people get for old age or invalids or whatever. And they got it. We want ritual recognition. And they got it. So this ritual recognition was an important part of their assertion that they were superior citizens. And they are absolutely determined that Anzac Day will become a public holiday. They campaign incessantly for this, and eventually they get it in 1926. 1927 is the first year in which it's observed right across Australia as a public holiday. It had been a sort of part holiday before that in different jurisdictions. And there's also the fact that as the reality drops away a little bit, as the wounds start to heal and the grief starts to fade, then you can start to spin stories, and then you can start to spin commemorative myths around it. And from then it starts to take off.
It's something that, well, I mean, speaking as a bloke, and I suppose not trying to compare myself at all with soldiers, but the mates that I hung around with in my 20s, if we meet now, it's just a pack of lies or myths that really, and bravado, isn't it? So we create myths as human beings. So did the soldiers, and you say that after the reality began to slip away, they became older, perhaps they wanted to then start to talk about it in a way that wasn't too confronting. Were they also responsible for some of the myths of mateship?
Well, actually, mateship doesn't crop up a hell of a lot in the interwar period. It's sort of much later that it comes into the picture, maybe not even to the 70s or the 80s. It was about courage and sacrifice and bravery and all these... Yeah, a bit, but it wasn't quite the cornerstone. But again, we're taking our national qualities, our national ideals, and we impose them on Anzac. So we make the legend fit what we want to hear. Clifford Geertz, a sociologist in the 1970s, talked about culture as stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves. And I think Anzac is very much that. It's a story we tell ourselves about ourselves. My reading of the Returned Soldier magazines in the interwar period is that by about the mid-1920s, you're getting the very effect that you're talking about, that retelling humorous stories from the front. They're not actually that interested in reliving the reality of it. They're interested in telling stories. It's all, I'm trying to think of a polite way of saying piss and win, but I can't. I'm sure the diggers would have approved. But stories they tell themselves about themselves, and they concentrate on the little anecdotes, the funny incidents. It's not the personalities of individual soldiers. It's not, my God, how horrible was that? How are we dealing with it? There's not surveys about how people are faring in employment, etc., etc.
Just further to Martin's point about mateship not being a huge theme of the stuff around Anzac early. Another thing which we associate with them is a kind of Larrikinism, and we see that as something which is admirable about the Australians. In fact, that was actually something which was not a feature of this legend during the wartime. Larrikinism was not something that was valued. In fact, one of the reasons, I think, a very significant reason why there was this sense with which Gallipoli was fated as this moment was that the Australians kind of proved themselves as soldiers, because there was great concern about their kind of moral outrages around things like Larrikinism in Australia. That was something which was essentially a pejorative term. And there was also a great fear in Australia that somehow, having descended from convicts, that there was this prevailing sense with which we would not meet the high expectations of the British race. And so that this idea was invested. And so once the Australians actually managed to get onto the beach and do a bit, all of a sudden, this somehow alleviated, and what's called this great sigh of relief. So the idea about the Australians being larrikins at the time is not something which is celebrated. In fact, when they're in Cairo during their training session, there's a major riot there, and Charles Bean writes back and says, some of the boys behaved pretty badly, and there was a sense with, oh God, what are they doing? So there's it's the story that's built into it, that Gallipoli becomes this moment where, oh, thank God, they're actually all right. They're true blue sort of thing,
How was it used? How was Anzac Day used in the Second World War when presumably we again had to raise an army? Was it used in the same way?
It was to some extent, but in my reading, not necessarily a hell of a lot. It probably early in the war, I think it becomes obvious. There's the various cartoons of over to you now, son. First AIF veteran basically handing responsibility down to his son. And there's a sort of convenience about that because of the 20-year or 21-year gap between it is a generation. But I think that by about 1941, 42, you don't really need that. The possibility of Japanese invasion and the horrors of Nazism are enough. And of course we have conscription. So we can get people into the armed forces as much as we need to by 1942, 43. And then after that, the Australian Army is demobilising, that they're reducing the numbers of personnel in any case. So at the start, when they're trying to sort of whip up enthusiasm or try to generate voluntary recruiting into the AIF to go and fight in the Middle East or to go and fight with Britain, yes, but not as much as you might expect.
So over the years, it's been conscripted for all sorts of purposes. Recently, we saw the Woolworths ads and an enormous reaction to those. I'm assuming there has been a history, though, of commercialism associated with Anzac Day.
Yeah, it's the use of the word Anzac and the exploitation of Anzac was outlawed by, firstly in the War Precautions Act and then by specific legislation, I think in 1919.
So there was actually legislation to outlaw the commercialisation.
Was it?
Is that right?
1916.
Yeah, very, very early. So this was sacred. You didn't want to use it for, it'd be like having Jesus on the cross as a marketing tool. You just didn't want to use it. And the RSL was all over anyone who violated that. The commercialism aspect of it is something that's grown up gradually in my reading since about the mid-90s, I think. Often subtly, often a little bit less so. Newspapers have used it to increase circulation. TV stations have used it to boost ratings, which we might consider as being quite legitimate. Then Anzac cookies were allowed to be sold, I think, from 1998, but only because a portion of the proceeds went to veterans' causes. Then there's been more recent things such as the VB Raise a Glass campaign, McDonald's giving free coffee to veterans, all those sorts of things. Where I think Woolworths went wrong was they just took it too far, and it was just too explicit. And I think that by having that meme generator, they set themselves up.
So they were mocked pretty thoroughly, weren't they?
They're absolutely mocked, and I don't have them with me, but I've got a wonderful collection now of lest we forget, fresh in our memories type memes, and some of them are, well, one of them is the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, which I think is quite funny, fresh in our memories. Yeah. But there's graphic images from World War I trenches. One of the most amusing ones, I think, was Franklin's, which Woolworths took over. So fresh in our memories, the Franklin sign. And it's been interesting that there's been a backlash against that. I think that Woolworths just made it a little bit too explicit. If they hadn't had that fresh in our memories thing, if they hadn't had the Woolworths logo on it, I think they would have got away with it. But I just think they were just a little bit too blatant about it.
But I do know that not Anzac legends, but other war images are used in association, obviously, with advertising. And there was something I saw somewhere recently about a group of blokes in a trench from World War One, saying they could only put up with this if they, thanks for the Rexona. So it's not really that unusual. It's interesting, isn't it, that Anzac is so sacred?
Yeah, it's interesting about sacredness, and tomorrow morning I'm going to speak in a high school. I'm going out to a group of Year 9 students, and I'm going to talk to them. And I was talking to someone about, how you define that sacredness. And I think a question to ask a group of 14-year-olds would be, have you ever talked in a classroom when you weren't supposed to? Have you ever talked at school assembly when you weren't supposed to? And these are Catholic students. Have you ever talked at Mass when you weren't supposed to? What would happen if you talked during the minute silence at the school's Anzac Day event? And the sense with which that is elevated as a moment of respect. I would suspect if you did that, there'd be peer group pressure. Only the most severe ADHD kid would be out there, and his friends would be his or her friends would be letting them very, very quickly that this was entirely inappropriate behaviour. So there is the sense with which it is something that's sacred in Australia. And a story I've told is about, just speculating, that if you were to stand up in a pub in Australia and say, all politicians are bastards, you'll get a number of people who want to buy you a drink. But if you stood up in a pub and said Anzac Day is just a load of rubbish, you'd run serious risk of offending people. There's every chance that someone would want to punch your head in, I think. So in a country like Australia, which typically doesn't take itself very seriously, Australia Day, for example, it's about lying down, watching the cricket, cooking lamb and, wearing sort of summer clothes. It's one of the few things that we do actually revere. It occupies a space, a kind of spiritual space, in what is a very secular society. And some would suggest that we still need that, and that the people who are sitting on the beach on the dawn service wrapped in flags are 20-year-olds, 20 and 30-year-olds. And many of them who were raised in a very secular kind of way. They weren't regular churchgoers. But yet there is something a need for ritual, a moment of spirituality that touches Australians. I don't know what Martin's thoughts are on that.
Yeah, that's. I agree with everything that Mark has said. It has also been suggested that because we are a secular society, people need something that they can believe in. There has to be something bigger than themselves, and that Anzac provides that for people. The Empire no longer does that. God doesn't do that for most people. But here is something that your young average Australian can actually think, right, I'm going to stop and connect with something that has a spiritual dimension to it, and it might be the only thing in their lives where they really do that.
And tied up with nationalism, is there a danger, do you think, in the future, that it could become, well, obviously there is a danger, but could we go too far, I suppose?
I kind of think we have already, to tell you the truth. I find the sight of my countrymen standing on foreign shores of a country we invaded, wrapped in the Australian flag, drinking beer and lying on the graves of dead people, I find it a bit offensive, frankly. I should say too that my interest in Anzac goes back, 20 odd years. So I'm not someone who's knocking the whole thing. In 1996 and again in 2000, I went around a lot of the cemeteries on the Western Front. And in those days, there were a lot fewer people who did that than there are now. And one of the most, it still brings tears to my eyes and raises the hairs on my neck, is read the epitaphs that families left behind. On all of those headstones, you get the person, you get the date of death, you get their age, and you often get a short message from their families. It could be up to 66 characters long. I don't know why 66, but it was. And they had to pay a small fee, but they could put a message on there. And I don't have them with me, obviously, but I show them in lectures when I lecture to students, and it invariably reduces a few people to tears, and it always makes my voice shaky too. These are real people who died real deaths, and they died in bloody awful ways. They are an enormous loss and waste to Australia. And if you read those epitaphs, you can sense the shockwave that comes home. I think anyone who is a parent knows that the worst thing would be to outlive your children. My 6-year-old once said to me, he said, "Daddy, will you die before I do?" And I said, "I bloody hope so, because I don't want to be burying you." And of course, they were never going to get over there. Very, very few of them were ever going to be able to make the pilgrimage to the Western Front. They weren't going to have a gravesite to visit. That's actually another point that we should raise. They weren't going to be able to go there and lay flowers on the grave. But they could leave these little messages. And often they're pretty predictable, rest in peace or duty done. But some of them are just devastating. Another life lost, hearts broken for what? In memory of my dearly loved husband and father, from Mabel and Jack. And I thought, well, what happened to Mabel and Jack? Another life, would God that I could die for thee, my son, my son. A couple of and I read one that simply said, "Where's our daddy?" Now, when you think about that kind of thing, there's death and loss, and it deserves to be commemorated. The fact that 60,000 young Australians were slaughtered in this awful war, 2 of them returned to Australia, Thomas Bridges in 1915 and the unknown soldier who was brought back in 1993. We've got to have a little bit of respect for the sentimentality around it. I want the sentimentality and the history to exist side by side and to not get confused. That might be asking too much. But I think there is kind of sacred dimension to it. When you walk along and you read those epitaphs and you contemplate this 18-year-old, 18. I've got a 14-year-old boy, he's only 4 years older than that. And to hark back to another point about the strength of the Anzac legend and its religious-like nature in Australia, part of it is because the bodies didn't come back. So there's no funeral. And you can't go to the gravesite. So it's been suggested that Anzac Day is a sort of surrogate funeral and war memorials are surrogate graves. Now in England, for example, you had a much better chance of going over to France and seeing your dead son. A lot of those people were wounded and died sometime afterwards in hospitals in England, so a lot of them are buried in England. Very few of them are buried in Australia. We have Anzacs who are buried in Australia, but they're ones who came home and then died of war wounds or died of war-related causes afterwards. But there's very few of them. So it has that funereal aspect to it as well.
Just taking up on Martin's point about emotion. Emotion has always been a part of this thing. But it seems to me, from my observation, that it's the nature of that emotion which has shifted. The emotion in 1916 and 1926 and 1936 and etc. is about the trauma, the bereavement, the loss, not just the death of loved ones, which was incredibly powerful, but the damage done to families on the return. I mean, they were dealing with a whole generation who were traumatized. We read the statistics on the casualties there. We don't know the statistics about how many men came home, walked up the back shed a couple of years later and stuck a 303 into their mouths, how many beat their wives, how many beat their kids, how many became drunken, bastards. You've got this wave of damage and trauma which moves through Australian society in the wake of the war. There's nothing good about it. We still have the emotion around Anzac Day, but it's a kind of sentimental sense, and there seems to be nostalgia and sentiment, and I wonder if that's what's taken the place of the trauma as the traumatized generations have moved on, and that concerns me a bit because I think it's really important for us, as Martin said, to remember the trauma, because the message should be we should stop having wars. And that's not a message which actually comes through Anzac Day at all.
And so it's probably a good point now, Mark, to talk a little bit about Eric Bogle's song, which does point out the trauma of war. And Mark's going to play us, hopefully, a little bit of the band played Waltzing Matilda. But maybe, would you mind? And if there's any,
I'll tell you a bit about
that'd be great.
Just while Mark's getting his guitar, I'll just build on that point about trauma. These were very, very damaged people who came home. A lot of them had been away for 3 or 4 years. They'd seen the most horrific things, done the most horrific things. They'd also been taught that violence is the way to achieve the ends that you want. Now, for Australian society, you've got to bring 200,000 of these people back at the end of the war, and you've got to reintegrate them. One way to reintegrate them is to say, we appreciate what you did. We thank you for your efforts. We acknowledge your suffering, yada, yada. One way to deal with the mass bereavement in Australia is to give it a higher purpose. So Anzac answers to some of these immediate needs in the interwar period. And a point that I often make is that it's traumatised veterans who are not appreciated by their society when they return, who are at the forefront of the rise of fascism in Italy and in Germany. So, and we also have this terrible problem, or had this terrible problem of reintegrating Vietnam veterans, because they didn't get that same sense of validation. So the Anzac Legend performed a very important role, I think, post-war in just smoothing things down. Alistair Thompson has a wonderful phrase about composing memories. Not just the way we write them, but achieving composure through making your memories selective, through forgetting some things and playing up others. And I think that Anzac Legend does that for the bereaved, it does it for the veterans, it does it for the politicians, who are probably thinking, what the hell do we do? It does it for other civic leaders who could have those questions asked of them. It just sort of smooths things down and papers things over. And I think in the shorter term, or short to medium term, that was a very, very valuable and important role that it performed. Anyway, I'm holding.
That's a really good way of putting it, and I think that's a perspective that's really should be understood by everybody. Mark?
Yeah, well, I don't have a microphone anymore because I can't hold the microphone singing.
I don't think you'll need it. You'll be fine.
Just about the song, though, many of you will have heard the song "The Band Played Waltzing Matilda" by Eric Sobel, and it's a good song. I enjoy, it's a really powerful song. It's obviously written during the 70s. He actually tells a story for songwriters that he entered into a songwriting competition and it came third. We don't know what came first and second. That says more about songwriting competitions than it does about the song. I kind of reassure myself as I saw it. It's an interesting song, as I've said. But one of the, I talk to people about what are some of the problems with the song, which is in some ways an artifact of its historical period. But the thing that interests me most is the fact that the band would not have played Waltzing Matilda. So when the troops are returning from fighting in the war, they were returning as, part of the British Empire. Therefore, what would they have been playing? God Save the King, Rule Britannia, Land of Hope and Glory. Maybe Australia will be there. But to play a song like Waltzing Matilda would actually have been quite transgressive at the time. Soldiers may have sung it, but military bands would not have played it at significant observances and events like that. So I'll play the song, and it might be a nice way to go out. Oh, when I was a young man, I carried me pack. I lived the free life of a rover. From the Murray's green basin to the dusty outback, I waltzed my Matilda all over. Till in 1915 the country said, son, it's time to stop rambling, there's work to be done. So they gave me a tin hat and they gave me a gun, and they sent me away to the war. And the band played Waltzing Matilda as the ship pulled away from the quay. Amidst all the cheers, flag waving and tears, we sailed off for Gallipoli. Well, I remember that terrible day, blood stained the sand and the water. And how at that hell that they called Suvla Bay, we were butchered like lambs at the slaughter. Johnny Turkey was ready, he'd primed himself well. He rained us with bullets, showered us with shell, and in 5 minutes flat, well, he'd blown us to hell. Nelly blew us right back to Australia, and the band played Waltzing Matilda. So we stopped to bury our slain. We buried ours, the Turks buried theirs, and we started all over again. And those that were living just tried to survive in a mad world of blood, death and fire. For 10 weary weeks I kept myself alive, as around me the corpses piled higher. Then a big Turkish shell knocked me ass overhead, and when I awoke in me hospital bed, oh Christ, I wished I was dead. Never knew there'd be worse things than dying. For I'll go no more waltzing Matilda around the green bush wild and free. For I'm tending pegs, a man needs both legs. No more waltzing Matilda for me. They collected the wounded, the crippled, the maimed, and shipped us back home to Australia. The armless, the legless, the blind and insane, the proud wounded heroes of Suvla.